Hello everyone, welcome back. Today is the day you have been waiting for, the last lecture of our Modern Global Issues class. Today we're going to be wrapping up the third unit, Clash of Cultures, by taking a look at a much broader issue. Up until this point we've kind of been looking at the history of the Middle East, and today we're going to take a more global lens and take a look at the rise of extremism throughout the globe. I mentioned last time about the attacks on 9/11, and with the terrorist attacks that happened on September 11, 2001, America really, in a lot of ways, kind of woke up. It changed our history forever, and not in a good way. Basically, our foreign policy changed. Everything about American life and government changed as a result of the extremist attacks on 9/11. Now, these terrorists, we're going to dig a little bit deeper as to what the motivations were for that attack, but we're also going to look at the rise of extremism overall, just kind of this trend that's been happening over the last few decades, see some other examples of terrorist incidents that have taken place, and ultimately we're going to look at why terror exists. So join us for this look at extremism, another topical lesson for today, but I hope you get a lot out of it here. So first of all, it's always important to define terms we're going to be using quite a bit. That term terrorism, it gets thrown around a lot. The use of violence against civilians in pursuit of political, religious, or ideological change. So that's pretty broad, but we're going to look at the different types of terrorism here in a second, but that at the basic level is what terrorism is all about. It is an attack on civilians. These are not military targets. These are not often even government targets. You know, the attacks on 9/11 were attacking the World Trade Center, which was kind of a center of business in New York City, and frankly, many of those that died were just people like you and me that were working an average job in those buildings. So, this is specifically designed to create terror within civilian populations to try and get change to happen. The scary thing about terrorism is that it often works, not condoning it, but when you look at the historical examples, it's tough to fight against. So we're going to take the look back all the way back to when it was first used. The first time we ever saw the word terrorism was as a result of the French Revolution, the reign of terror. You might have studied that in world history. But terrorism will increase, and by the late 1800s, you start to see terrorism become more commonplace through assassinations. In fact, the United States will deal with multiple presidents that are assassinated, some of which are killed by anarchists that are trying to use terrorist incidents to promote change and anarchy throughout America. But ultimately, the types of terrorism we're going to see are going to become, over the last 100 years, much more violent. We're going to see much bigger incidences of terror, and as I said, it has a revolutionary change in its effects. So let's start by breaking down the four different types of terrorism. First is state-sponsored terrorism, and there's a lot of debate because again, what is one country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighter to some people, but that line of terrorism kind of gets blurred from time to time. But ultimately, state-sponsored terrorism is violence conducted by a government against citizens of a country. The most obvious form of state terror took place in the 1930s and 40s with the Holocaust. The Nazi German government led a systematic genocide of the Jewish people as well as other opponents of theirs, and that included everyone from communists to artists to teachers. Anyone that stood in the way of the Nazi regime, they murdered. That is state-sponsored terrorism, and perhaps the greatest example of it that we could utilize here. The next example is one that we've sadly suffered in our own country: vigilante terrorism. This is when violence is committed by private citizens against other private citizens. The example I've given you here is the KKK. After the Civil War, there was a tremendous fear in the South that the way of life was going to change. You just had 4 million recently freed slaves, and as the Southern society had, for centuries at this point, had segregated the races, wanted complete separation, wanted to basically put African Americans down a peg or two in the social ladder. The KKK used terrorism to try and make that happen. And again, in a lot of ways, it worked, sadly. They committed murder. They terrorized by intimidating people from participating in the political process. If you, even though the Civil War amendments had helped guarantee African Americans the right to vote, if your choice is going to vote and perhaps having your home burned or you being killed as a result of you voting, you're probably not going to vote. But a lot of people knew that the KKK would show up if they went to cast their vote and ultimately could murder their whole family. I don't know about you, but that kind of terrorism might keep me from, practicing democracy. The KKK continues to exist today. They have gone through different waves of popularity, but I can't think of a greater example of vigilante terrorism than the KKK, with really what is America's first and major terrorist group that has existed for decades in this country, and as I said, sadly continues to this day. The third type of terrorism is insurgent terrorism. This is when violence is committed by private citizens against their own government. Another example of this is in 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing. There were two men that perpetrated this event. Both of them were former veterans of the Persian Gulf War. And when they came back, what they saw was they believed that the federal government had declared war on the people. They believed that they were coming to take their guns, that they were, basically had an open war. They saw America, what they felt, turning into a police state, and so they believed that it was their duty to respond. They looked at events like what happened in Ruby Ridge and Waco. If you have a moment, I'd urge you to look up those events. But they saw those kind of events as the federal government declaring war on them, and so they were basically returning the favor. Now, how they did that was by attacking a federal building, which, again, many civilians were working at, including a daycare on the bottom floor, which had 19 children in it that were all killed by this attack. But Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols planted a van outside the federal building in Oklahoma City, chock full of explosives that was detonated. As you can see, ripped the entire side away from the federal building there and ultimately killed 168 people. That at the time was the worst terrorist incident that our nation had ever suffered. I remember I was 12 years old at the time. I remember vividly watching this on television, just not understanding why these people would attack us. This is such just a tremendously tragic event. But these men truly felt as if they were at war with the government, and they had convinced themselves of that fact, and they were conducting war by killing innocent people. The fourth type of terrorism is transnational terrorism, and this is when you see violence committed by citizens of one nation against targets in another. Now, this can take on a lot of different forms. I've included 9/11 here, and we're going to talk about that more in detail here in a second. But, the terrorists that attacked us on 9/11 all came from Saudi Arabia, and they had a lot of animosity towards the United States. Osama bin Laden's group, Al-Qaeda, had been formed with kind of a central theme of hatred for the United States, in particular what we had done in the Persian Gulf War of inhabiting Saudi Arabia, using that as a jumping off point to invade Iraq. But ultimately, this attack that took place on 9/11, again, not necessarily directed at the government per se, but instead trying to commit massive acts of violence and murder against U.S. citizens to try and get them to I guess in some sense for revenge, but also to try and change their lifestyle, and it's worked. It sadly has worked. America has made a lot of changes, many of them for the worse, as a result of these attacks. Now, I know we've talked about 9/11 a few times, but I did want to take you through the key details again, because this, I think, as America, as our history moves on, we're going to look back at this event being perhaps the most pivotal in our nation's history. On the morning of September 11, 2001, you had a group of extremists, Islamic extremists, attack the United States, ultimately coordinating an attack that hijacked 4 separate planes, two of which struck the World Trade Center, one struck the Pentagon, and another that was heading towards D.C., but after passengers on board found out that a hijacking was taking place and multiple hijackings were taking place, ultimately tried to take the plane back, and the terrorists crashed it into the ground, killing everyone on board. Now, the day itself was one of the most tragic, if not the most tragic in American history. As I said, on live TV, we watched literally thousands of people die before our eyes as those buildings collapsed on the hundreds of EMT and policemen and firemen that had rushed inside those buildings to save people. It was just a tremendously horrible day. The result, as we talked about, was two wars, the invasion of Afghanistan a month later, and then a year and a half later, the invasion of Iraq. Another impact that was had was that the United States passed a law called the Patriot Act, which gave the government much broader powers in terms of hunting down terrorists. But we have seen since then, in the decades that have followed, the Patriot Act being abused, that the U.S. government has gone beyond what was expected. In fact, the authors of the Patriot Act themselves have been interviewed saying that we were not expecting this law to be used in this manner. One example of that is with the PRISM program. If you're unfamiliar with that, the U.S., which, with due process, which we all have a right to, because of the 14th Amendment, the government must have a warrant whenever they come into your house or whenever they get information on you, private information. But instead of actually acknowledging that right, the government instead had a massive surveillance program set up not only on every person in the United States, but frankly throughout the world, including our allies. And every phone conversation, every text message, every email had been tracked at some point in collecting metadata. The excuse here was that, if we collect everything, it's not necessarily singling individuals out, and therefore we don't need a warrant. That has not necessarily past scrutiny. I mean, there's been a lot of abuse like that has happened, and some of which I'm sure will be uncovered in decades that follow. Now, it wasn't just a betrayal of our ideals and a decline of our civil rights in America that was a result. We also saw those two wars, as I said, as a result of the Bush Doctrine, that have ultimately cost us over $5 trillion since the attacks took place. A tremendously horrible day, and sadly, a lot of the fear-based decisions that were made in the weeks following have set us on a course that frankly I think many would like to go back from. But this was a pivotal event that has been very costly in terms of blood and treasure for future generations of Americans. The second case study that we're going to look at in terms of terrorism is the rise of ISIS. Now, last lecture we talked about the decline of Iraq, the civil war that happened there after 2003 and the invasion of that country, but also we talked about the civil war in Syria, which basically broke down society in Syria. Now, in the midst of that chaos and frankly a lack of government control, you had a terrorist group rise up. The people that had created what they called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They tried to form, they did form another terrorist group called ISIS, sometimes referred to as ISIL, or simply the Islamic State. And they attempted to create a new nation, a caliphate, one in which they would be seen as kind of the heads of the Islamic faith. Now, the extremist ideology they had, very backwards, and most Muslims disagreed with their violence and disagreed with their overall message. But their goal was to inflict a Sharia law, a strict Quran-based law, and they, for a while, had control of vast amounts of Syria and Iraq, and it looked as if ISIS is perhaps even going to spread and take over the entire region. Ultimately, the peak of ISIS would happen around 2015. All the nations of the world have a common enemy here in ISIS, as they have inflicted terror in those cities, but also abroad. You have terrorist incidents that have happened even in the United States with people that have declared their allegiance to ISIS. So these ideas have spread because of communications over the internet. But ISIS today is not nearly as strong as it was. The last few administrations have really gone to war with ISIS, and today they have lost almost all of the territory that they claimed, although ISIS does remain alive and well in some situations, even though they don't have physical control over the cities, they still do exist underground. We've seen multiple terrorist incidents take place that have ISIS inspirations, and frankly, it's something that we're probably going to have to deal with for years into the future. Now, as I just went through and talked about some of the detail of this, in 1995, the bombing at Oklahoma City, we saw these former veterans, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, carry out a deadly terror attack, which destroyed a lot of the federal building, the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 innocent people, again, 19 of which were children. But Timothy McVeigh would ultimately be convicted of this, and he was a right-wing extremist that believed, again, that he was at war with the U.S. government, and this was another act in that war. Frankly, after he was arrested, was unapologetic to the end of his life. He was ultimately executed for this attack. But again, that mindset of people believing that they are at war with the U.S. government still remains today, and we have seen other terrorist incidents targeting both the government as well as police, in which they believe themselves to have kind of picked up in the same banner as Timothy McVeigh here in the attack on Oklahoma City, including some events that have happened recently. Some of those that attacked the Capitol on January 6th had ideological ties to this group, we are not done seeing this belief that people think that they are at war with the government and attack civilians to try and somehow even that score. In 2015, we saw another tragic and just horribly well-coordinated attack in Paris, France. There were multiple suicide bombers that basically planned out multiple attacks simultaneously throughout the city. At first, there was a soccer match that was going on. 3 suicide bombers attempted to get into that soccer match to blow themselves up in the middle of the crowd. They failed. They were stopped by guards before they could get in. Ultimately, they did detonate their suicide vests, killing themselves and multiple people around them in the stadiums, but not nearly as bad as it could have been. In other parts of the city, as policemen were rushing to the stadium to help put down the threat, there were multiple other attacks happening at parts throughout the city. There were attacks on restaurants and bars that people were going into, just open up mass shootings. The worst of these coordinated attacks took place at a rock concert that was going on. You had terrorists storm the building, a jam-packed building, hundreds of people inside listening to this concert, and they began to open fire on these, and ultimately 130 people were killed in these attacks. Tremendously horrible event. Some of the deadliest fighting, some of the deadliest attacks we've seen in Europe since World War II. ISIS did claim responsibility, and basically stating that it was because of the French airstrikes in Syria and Iraq against ISIS that they perpetrated this event. So again, another example that ISIS continues to have basically cells out there in the Western world that is open to attacking civilians in response to that group. So just a horrible day for Paris, and one that has changed that country a lot in their response as well. Going back a few years, in 2008, there was another terrorist incident that took place in Mumbai, India. This took place at a Western hotel. There were many Westerners staying in this hotel. But this goes back to our previous unit when we were talking about the animosity between India and Pakistan. What occurred here was you had Pakistani terrorists coming over into India, attacking not only Indian targets but also Western targets. And ultimately, when they took the Taj Hotel in Mumbai, they moved from room to room, assassinating, killing, murdering guests in their rooms. Ultimately, there would be 175 individuals killed in those attacks, and as a result, troops were placed along the border. India, of course, blamed Pakistan. Pakistan, denied any claim, even though it has come out since that perhaps the attackers even had contact with people in higher levels of the Pakistani government. So again, when we talk about terrorism, sometimes it is purely in the mind of the individual terrorist, sometimes it is a broader group that operates perhaps within a region or globally, and sometimes it even has connections to governments. So sadly, terrorism is something that has existed throughout the world. It has become increasingly popular, and frankly, because it does have a tremendous impact on people, and frankly, as we've seen in the case of the United States, sometimes even gets us to make fear-based decisions that ultimately change our stance on things, even like civil rights. So just a horrible, horrible incident for India there. But that will, I hate to end our units on such a negative, discussion of history, but that will do it for us. Guys, I hope you enjoyed these series of lectures. Please email me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to get back to you. Thanks.